And I want to welcome everybody first. Let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. And if you would look at the table of contents with me, you can see the agenda here. But I want to explain a little bit more than that. We're in this kind of exciting times of all these regs coming out, and yet this, to me, is the foundational block to everything else that comes. Now, we're going to start out talking about Equal Credit Opportunity Act, but specifically, what's an application? And inside of that, what is not an application? What's a pre-qualification? Do things have to be documented? And then we'll start to put layers, more bricks on top of that, and we'll start to build a wall. We'll get into HMDA, we'll get into RESPA, Truth in Lending, et cetera, and talk about those things. But there's just so much that builds off of this. Now, I used to be an FDIC examiner. I was a loan officer, and for the last 20 years I've been a consultant. I'm going to tell you that the majority of questions that we get asked as consultants really aren't about RESPA and Truth in Lending and denials. They come back to this foundation of what is an application. And so it's just vitally important that we understand this. I also believe that most loan officers think they understand this topic. And I'm going to tell you, in my opinion, most don't. There is certainly lots of shades of gray. I'm going to try to make this as black and white, if you will, as possible. But even in my teaching today, there are some times where there can be little derivatives and things like that. And that's where the question breaks, and give me your thoughts and comments and questions, and we'll try to address those. And as Sam mentioned, even when the webinar is over, there'll be some time to submit questions, and we'll try to get those answered and back to you in a timely manner. So what I won't discuss today is really getting into, even though I'm setting the table, is RESPA and Truth in Lending and denials. And we're going to touch a little bit down in there, Roman numeral 9 and 10, about requiring signatures and joint applicants. But that's really another webinar, and I'll show you, it's coming up here in just a few days. We're going to do kind of a companion webinar about joint intent. So I'm going to touch on that, but it's a 2-hour topic all by itself. And so there just isn't time to cover this material and that material. And so, if you will, I've had one pre-submitted question about joint intent, but there really isn't the instructions, today much to get into that. So RESPA and all the facets of that. Now, we'll talk about applications for RESPA, applications for Truth in Lending, those types of things. But it's hard to carve out just this little bit and hold it to 2 hours. So the other thing I want you to know, if you look at the packet with me, or at the very bottom of the table of contents, you'll see a bullet that says, if you see things in italics, I'm quoting from the regulations themselves. So if you go to page 1, you'll notice that there's some italicized wording in like 1A. Now, I don't like to just regurgitate regs. One of my rules is I want to tell you what I think it says. But sometimes it's important to look directly at the regulation and say, this is straight from the horse's mouth, if you will. And then when you see non-italics, I'm just making that part up. No, I'm trying to explain to you what I think it says. So let's get started. Let's go on to page 1, and let's start out talking about an inquiry versus an application. Now, before we really get into all this, I'm just going to give you the cliff notes. When it comes to inquiries, you don't have to do anything. There is no denial requirements at that point. There's no disclosures that are triggered. There's nothing that has been, I guess the ball's in your court. Let me say it again. The ball is not in your court. You don't have to do anything on inquiries. When it comes to applications, in most cases, you're either going to make a loan or a denial. Now, yes, we have withdrawals or files closed for incompleteness, that type of thing. But the ball is in your court, and you're going to have to do something with it. So that's why this distinction is very important. Let me give you the cliff notes on that. An inquiry is when you talk policy. You're not making decisions. You don't have enough information to make a decision. On the other hand, an application is when I do have enough information to make a decision. Maybe I haven't given it back to them yet. I haven't said yes or no, but I do have enough information that I could say yes or no, assuming that it's all true. So that's what I'm about to explain to you. I like to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'll tell you to you, and then I'll tell you what I told you. So let's get on page 1, Roman numeral 1. So what is an application? And just like that opening paragraph, that distinction between inquiry and application is vitally important. So let's be clear about this. An application, if you've got a pen, you've got a highlighter, circle, highlight this thing, can be oral. It does not have to be in writing. That's right out of the horse's mouth, if you will, right there in the regs, and you'll see in the brackets where I'm taking that from. an oral or written request for an extension of credit. Now, they do give you a little bit of wiggle room. The reg says made in accordance with your procedures. Notice it doesn't say policy. Let's look at letter B. Your procedures are your actual practices. Don't tell me that your policy is always have a Fannie Mae 1003 for home loans, because sometimes I know that loan officers might have a yellow pad or a sticky note. Think about somebody calling in and they paint some horrible scenario, like, I just declared bankruptcy and I'm wondering if I can get a loan. Or this is a real case. When I was a loan officer, I had a person, by the way, if you're a loan officer, at one point you were new, and every loser in town comes to see you, and so you get all these really bad applicants. And I had this guy come in, and he basically said he wanted to borrow money so that he could file bankruptcy. And I just stopped him and tilted my head 45 degrees to the right and said, what? I was like, are you kidding me? So I don't need any more information. We haven't filled anything out. I just wrote the word loser across the notepad and showed him to the door. Okay, I'm trying to be a little bit funny. I didn't do that. But actual practices in that case, sticky pad, or it could be a sticky note, yellow pad. Could be a cocktail napkin, depending on where you're meeting this person, all right? But actual practices, and if you read on, as well as your stated procedures. So it might be your policy is what they're getting at, stated application procedures, to say that we always get an application form. But I'm going to challenge you. Really? Do you really do that? Especially when you get into non-consumer stuff. It's very common for business, for agricultural loans, to have applicants just call you. Let me go a step further. An established applicant or borrower already calls up and is looking at a new type of loan. You already have a 3-inch thick file on them. Actual practices in that case a lot of times are just to jot down a few things. So if you go back to letter A, verbal request for an extension of credit made in accordance with your procedures. Now, you might transfer that information later to some type of application form, but that is beyond already the date and time, if you will, of your application. Imagine this if you can. I'm standing in front of you, and I'm holding up these forms that you call applications. There's a Fannie Mae 1003, and there's the consumer one, and they use the word application at the very top. Listen, I'm going to say these things in my hands that you're seeing me, okay, these are not applications. They document an application. I hope you follow me. An application is an exchange of information. We're talking. That's an application. We put that on a piece of paper and call it an application, but it's really an application form. If you get nothing else maybe from the day, that's it. That a piece of paper is not an application. It's an exchange of information as an application. And again, we put that on a piece of paper. So when a loan officer says, well, they didn't fill out my application, not necessary. Or they didn't sign it, not necessary. Or, it was just a phone call. So what? Who cares? That's what I want you to get out of this. That's the first block down on this first brick that we're going to lay. Okay? Now, if you read in there that in the second line of B, example, the creditor's stated policies require applicants to be in writing, but you make credit decisions based on a verbal request or oral request, then you are accepting both oral and written. And I would say when I was an examiner in the last 20 years as a consultant, when a bank says to me, nope, we never, ever take applications without it being in written form, that becomes a challenge. There have been a few banks that I have said, yep, I agree with you, but very few. Very few. So if that's your policy and you believe that that's your actual procedures, I would question that you want to challenge that and maybe look for situations, or maybe we're missing it. We're not always considering what is truly an application to be an application. We're saying, no, that's an inquiry. We might be wrong. So B2, you might have some informal inquiries that really are applications that you're not treating as such. Now, let's go to letter C here. They even define in the reg what a completed application is. And it says, basically in bold print there, when you've received all the information that you need, all the information you rather obtain and consider, that's an application. That's a completed application, in fact. Notice it didn't say and signed or on a form of any kind. Now, it does go on and say for the amount and type of credit requested. So, yeah, if I'm asking for a $1,000 overdraft protection line, you probably have a different application process than if I'm asking for a $1 million line of credit. I get that, and that's what they're trying to say here. Maybe for your overdraft protection lines of credit, you're looking at basically, oh, they've had a checking account with us for 3 or 6 months, and that's sufficient, so we're good to go. And they haven't had any overdrafts, that kind of thing. Whereas when it comes to the $1 million line of credit, we need to have lots more information. And down the third line, I hate this, but the reg talks about credit reports, and it makes it sound like verification information is okay. I'll come back to this in just a little bit, but you really can't pull credit reports until you have an application. Say it this way. Look at letter D. You have to have an application first, and then you get to verify it. Okay? Verification information comes after the application. Let me illustrate that. You can't pull my credit report today just because I'm teaching this webinar. You have to have a legitimate business need. And what is that legitimate business need? It's that I'm applying. Or, it could be opening an account, those types of things. And when we get into RESPA and Truth in Lending, they nailed this. They actually wrote it right into the reg that said you can't ask for any verification information until after a good faith is delivered and there's intent to proceed and things like that. So this reg B was written way back in the early 70s, and there's just been some misinformation I wish they would clean up.